Author's note: the Quakers, the Society of Friends, an important religious group even today, was founded in England in 1652 by George Fox. Soon known as Quakers, tremblers in the presence of the Holy Spirit, they refused traditional forms of worship used in British churches, such as sermons and choirs. They were pacifists and refused to take oaths. Their beliefs led to their persecution and imprisonment in England. In 1681, Quaker convert William Penn was granted Pennsylvania as a royal colony. He viewed it as a refuge for Quakers and other persecuted groups. The society flourished in the New World, though its members were persecuted in the United States as well. Their meeting houses were to be seen up and down the East Coast. Members adopted plain, dark garments without buttons or ornamentation and wore special wide-brimmed bonnets, hats, and deep bonnets. By the mid-19th century, there were three groups: the Orthodox Quakers, the Hicksites, and the Wilburites. Quakers were humanitarians. They believed they answered to a higher law than human laws. God's light could be found in Indians and blacks as well as white men. Many Quakers were active in the anti-slavery movement and were involved in operating the Underground Railroad. One prominent figure of the railroad was a North Carolina-born Quaker, Levi Coffin. He operated one of the most successful stations in the entire network. Famous Quakers of this period were poet John Greenleaf Whittier and suffragist Lucretia Mott. At a time when women were not permitted to speak in church, Quaker women were encouraged to testify on First Day, or Sunday. They were as renowned for their quiet courage and steadfastness as the men. The justification for their taking part in church manners was the New Testament, in which it was written, "Women spoke to Jesus." Quaker men could serve as soldiers if they chose, but few did. In the Civil War era, many fled to the West or attempted to escape to Canada, but some were caught and forced into the Army or arrested and put in military prisons, both Union and Confederate, for refusing to take up arms. The situation was generally worse in the South. The men would usually refuse all military training and fall to the ground when soldiers advanced on foot, firing at one another. What happened to the fictional Bardwells could easily have happened. Men who had fled the Confederate Army were concealed in places throughout the South. 19th century Quakers used thee and thy, but not thou, in addressing members of their faith and non-members. The practice died out fairly recently, but I am told that some older friends still use this mode of address when speaking to one another. The Underground Railroad. One of the most exciting and secretive parts of the United States history revolves around the railroad with no rails, which was used to carry slaves to freedom in the North and in Canada. The people who operated the Underground Railroad in the South were nicknamed conductors. A conductor knew only the location of the next station and who brought him or her the slaves. Many women and men were involved. Slaves going in only one direction were not blindfolded, but anyone who went and then returned probably would have been to protect the identities of the conductors. This railroad existed not only in the East, but also in the Midwest. North Carolina. North Carolina seceded from the Union in May 1861. However, there was not a great deal of fighting within its borders. In March 1865, the Battle of Bentonville, a Union victory, was the last major fight there. It is a historical fact that a family remained in their home throughout the battle and survived. North Carolina sent 125,000 men to the Confederacy and lost 40,000 to battle, deaths, and disease. People in the book. Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave in the South in 1817, escaped to the North in 1838, got an education, and became a noted abolitionist orator. His friends in England helped him buy his freedom in 1847. He knew Abraham Lincoln and tried to convince him to enlist black soldiers before Lincoln was ready to do so. That refusal caused a coldness between them for a time. Quakers had befriended the young Douglass as a terrified runaway, so I believe it would have been in his character to favor them. In his later years, he was appointed minister to Haiti. Mary Todd Lincoln is one of the more controversial figures of the Civil War era. She was considered a vain, somewhat silly woman, and at times was a trial to her husband. Their oldest son, Robert, was her favorite. Her impulsiveness was well known. It would have been like her to intercede for truth with her husband. After Lincoln's death, she sent Frederick Douglass her husband's walking cane as a memento. She never recovered from her husband's assassination. In 1876, Robert Lincoln committed her to a mental institution. Her last years were spent at her sister's home in Springfield, Illinois. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was in failing physical health because of the enormous burden he carried as president. People remarked on his pallor, gauntness, weariness, and cold handshakes. It is a historical fact that he favored the Society of Friends. He was known to have said, "If a man is a friend, he is no prisoner of war." At the time of his assassination in April 1865, an article by a Quaker was found in his pocket. He truly had the power as president to set a prisoner free, and did so. Places in the book. I have described Goldsboro, North Carolina, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Elmira, New York, as historical accounts have them at the time. Any buildings from the old prison in Elmira would have long ago been razed. Trains could have been ridden to all 4 cities, though 19th century train travel could never be considered comfortable, and travel during Civil War days was even less so. Matthew Bardwell and Truth Hopkins would have needed special passes to travel in the South, and dared not request them, hence their use of the Underground Railroad. One of my chief sources in writing this novel was an old and probably rare book entitled Southern Heroes, written by Fernando Gale Cartland, Riverside Press, 1895, reprinted by Garland in 1972. When I casually plucked it from the university library shelf, I expected to find brief biographies of Southern leaders such as Lee, Stuart, Hood, and Davis. Instead, it was about Quakers in the Southern states. This fascinating volume was the genesis of my book.